Most people imagine the tabernacle as a simple tent pitched somewhere in the desert sand, a primitive shelter, hastily constructed, functional at best. But what rose from that barren ground was not simple. It was impossible. In the heart of endless sand, without modern technology, without infrastructure, without any rational explanation, gold melted at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. And it melted perfectly, precisely, as if the desert itself had bent to the will of something beyond nature. Nothing could fail. The materials were beyond precious, extracted from the wealth of Egypt itself. The work was laced with danger at every turn, one mistake away from catastrophe. The people were common, their hands scarred from slavery, their minds shaped by oppression. Yet somehow, in that crucible of impossibility, they would craft perfection. Each measurement followed exactly the pattern God revealed to Moses on the mountain, without improvisation, without shortcuts, without any margin for error. This was not merely construction. This was not simply religious architecture. What they built in those burning sands would become the dwelling place of the creator of the universe among his creation. The infinite confined within the finite. The eternal contained within wood and gold and fabric. It defies logic, challenges reason, and demands explanation. But before the first piece of gold liquefied, before the first acacia beam was cut, before any thread was woven, there was a moment on the mountain. Moses stood in the presence of the Almighty and saw something his earthly eyes were never meant to witness. He saw the blueprint of heaven itself, and when he descended, he carried with him not just commands written in stone, but the weight of an architectural vision that would prove either the salvation or the destruction of an entire nation. The story of the tabernacle is not a story of human achievement. It is a story of the impossible made real, of slaves transformed into master craftsmen, of the divine reaching down into the dust and declaring, "Here, in this place, I will dwell." What follows is not legend, it is recorded history, and it begins with a people who had no business building anything, let alone the house of God.
Before we start, I need your help. Subscribe to this channel so we can keep bringing these hidden truths to light.
When God delivered the tabernacle's design to Moses on Mount Sinai, he did not simply provide measurements and material lists. He showed Moses something that existed beyond the veil of the physical world, a celestial pattern, a heavenly reality that Moses witnessed with his own mortal eyes, burning itself into his memory with the intensity of divine fire. This was not architecture conceived by human imagination. This was a blueprint from another realm entirely. The pattern was absolute. Every dimension, every material, every detail carried weight beyond the physical. Moses saw it suspended in glory, perhaps shimmering in the air before him like a vision made tangible. The exact measurements were not suggestions. They were mandates, handed down from the throne of creation itself. 1 cubit too long, 1 thread the wrong color, 1 angle imperfectly cut, and the entire structure would fail its purpose. This was not simply about beauty or religious symbolism. This was about creating a point of intersection between two realities that were never meant to touch. But below, at the foot of the mountain, the people who would build this impossible structure were anything but qualified. They were not architects. They were not engineers. They were slaves, broken by generations of forced labor in Egypt. Their hands knew the weight of bricks, the sting of overseers' whips, the monotony of endless, meaningless toil. They had built monuments to Pharaoh's glory, structures that still stand millennia later, but they had built them as beasts of burden, not as craftsmen. Moses descended from the mountain carrying 2 things: stone tablets inscribed with the law, and in his mind, the complete vision of something that had never existed on earth. How do you translate heaven into wood and gold? How do you explain to former slaves that they must now craft something so precise, so perfect, that the creator of all things will make it his dwelling? The gap between the vision and the reality seemed insurmountable. Yet God does not give impossible commands without providing impossible means. What Moses saw on the mountain was not meant to mock human limitation. It was meant to shatter it. The tabernacle would prove that when God moves, when his spirit fills human vessels, the impossible becomes inevitable. The question was not whether it could be done. The question was whether the people would trust enough to try. Among thousands of freed slaves wandering the desert, God spoke a single name: Bezalel. Not a high priest, not a military commander, not a prophet, a craftsman. And in that moment, everything changed. The scripture records it with startling specificity. God filled Bezalel with his spirit, giving him wisdom, understanding, knowledge, and skill in all kinds of craftsmanship. This was not merely talent discovered. This was divine impartation, supernatural ability downloaded directly into human hands. Bezalel's selection reveals something profound about God's methods. He does not always choose the obvious candidate. He does not necessarily select those with the most experience or the highest pedigree. Sometimes he looks past the surface, past the resume, past even the person's own understanding of themselves, and sees potential that only divine eyes can detect. Bezalel was chosen not for what he was, but for what God would make him become. But even a spirit-filled man cannot build the tabernacle alone. The scope was too vast, the skills too varied, the work too intensive. So God appointed Oholiab to work alongside Bezalel, and he gave them both something perhaps more valuable than skill: the ability to teach. This was not knowledge hoarded. This was wisdom meant to multiply. The two master craftsmen would become conduits, channels through which divine ability would flow into the hands of common people. Imagine the scene: men whose backs were bent from years of slave labor in Egypt, whose hands were calloused from making bricks under the merciless sun, now gathered around Bezalel and Oholiab to learn arts they never dreamed they could master. They learned to shape wood with precision, to work metal until it flowed like water, to weave fabric with mathematical accuracy, to prepare dyes from rare materials. Their hands, once marked only by oppression, began to acquire the precision of artisans. These men were being transformed. They were no longer just ex-slaves wandering the desert. They were becoming builders of a living sanctuary, craftsmen in service of the Most High. The journey from bondage to sacred construction was not merely physical, it was ontological. They were being remade at the level of identity itself. And what was about to happen would prove that even in the most unlikely environment, God prepares people for works that transcend every human limitation. Gold becomes liquid at 1,064 degrees Celsius. Let that sink in. 1,064 degrees. In the middle of a desert, with no coal mines, no industrial furnaces, no advanced metallurgical equipment, somehow the Israelites needed to achieve and maintain temperatures that modern civilization requires specialized facilities to reach. The sheer audacity of the task seems almost cruel, yet it was commanded, and somehow, impossibly, it was accomplished. The answer lies partly in their past. During 400 years in Egypt, the Hebrews were not merely making bricks, they were living in the most technologically advanced empire of the ancient world. Even as servants, even as slaves, it was impossible to exist in that environment without absorbing knowledge. They witnessed advanced metallurgy, sophisticated ceramic production, complex construction techniques. Egypt's glory was built on knowledge, and that knowledge seeped into the consciousness of everyone within its borders, slave and master alike. But knowledge alone does not create fire hot enough to liquefy gold. In the Sinai desert, there was no noble wood, no proper fuel to sustain such intense heat. The solution came from the only abundant resource available, the acacia tree. That twisted, thorny tree that seemed useless on the surface concealed a secret. When converted into charcoal, acacia burned slowly, steadily, and far hotter than common firewood. Combined with clay furnaces molded directly from desert sand and fed by leather bellows that continuously injected air, the fire gained power, color, intensity. Picture the scene as if you were standing there. The desert sun beating down at 40 degrees Celsius, the ground too hot to touch with bare feet, the air so dry it burns your lungs with each breath. And just meters away, furnaces belching flames exceeding 1,000 degrees. It was impossible to remain near them for long. The heat was so extreme that tools had to be held with thick cloths. Splashes of molten metal were a constant threat. The lukewarm water in their skins evaporated too quickly to provide real relief. Yet the work could not stop. To shape the gold for sacred objects, from utensils to complete pieces, the fire had to remain alive for hours. Men took turns maintaining the airflow, a brutal rotation of suffering. And among all the pieces they would forge, one struck fear into the heart of every craftsman: the golden lampstand, the menorah. God's command was unambiguous. It must be made from a single piece of gold, not soldered, not assembled from parts. 1 talent of pure gold, approximately 35 kilograms, hammered and molded until it became a perfect lampstand. 1 miscalculation of temperature, 1 poorly placed strike, 1 crack, and all the material would need to be melted down again to start from zero. There, before that impossible fire, ex-slaves were being forged alongside the gold itself. While gold was being transformed by fire, another essential component of the tabernacle was being prepared at a completely different pace. Silent, patient, almost meditative, this was the structure, the skeleton, the foundation that would support everything. And this foundation was made from acacia wood, the wood of the desert itself. To any Hebrew, this choice seemed strange at first. Acacia was a crooked tree, thorny, difficult to cut, difficult to work with. Nothing about it suggested sacred construction. But God did not request common wood. He requested the wood that does not rot, the wood that insects will not devour, the wood that resists extreme heat and sandstorms. A wood as hard as stone, a wood that survived in the same desert where the people would survive for 40 years. The parallel was not accidental. Just as this seemingly worthless tree thrived where nothing else could, so too would Israel endure where logic said they should perish. The process of working acacia was brutal. Each board needed to be approximately 4.5 meters in height. Each one had to be perfectly straight, even though the tree grew twisted. Each one required exact measurements with no room for improvisation. Ex-slaves, accustomed to mud and bricks, now held adzes, saws, and primitive planes in their blistered hands. Transforming irregular trunks into smooth boards was a challenge both artistic and physically devastating. They sawed, planed, scraped, measured. The hardwood tore thick splinters from already calloused hands. Each board took days to complete, and when one was finally finished, there was no time to rest. It was time to begin another. They needed 48 identical boards, 48 pieces of perfection cut from imperfection, 48 monuments to patience extracted from impatience. The work was endless, thankless, and absolutely essential. But then came the most surprising detail. These boards, after being perfected through days of labor, were completely covered in gold. The crooked wood was transformed into something precious. The common was transformed into the sacred. What no one would value at first glance became the very structure of God's house. Glory visible on the inside, a simple tent covered with skins on the outside. The lesson was profound. God specializes in taking what the world considers worthless and making it the cornerstone of his purposes. The acacia wood, despised and overlooked, would hold up the dwelling place of the Almighty. The tabernacle was not a fixed temple. It had no stone foundations buried deep in bedrock. It could not be anchored into the ground because when God's cloud moved, everything had to be dismantled within hours. And here the project reveals engineering that surpasses the knowledge of its era. How do you keep dozens of massive boards standing upright? Boards covered in heavy gold plating on the unstable terrain of the desert? Placing them directly in sand was impossible. They would sink under their own weight, topple in the wind, shift at the slightest touch. The solution God gave Moses was so simple at first glance, yet so ingenious it challenges modern engineering principles. The answer was silver. Each acacia board covered in gold had 2 tenons at the bottom, like pins, and each pin fit perfectly into a massive silver base, 1 base for each tenon. These bases were not small. Each one weighed approximately 1 talent of silver, around 35 kilograms. Imagine the scene. 100 silver bases distributed with millimetric precision across the desert floor to support an entire structure. These bases functioned as mobile footings, heavy enough to provide stability, precisely molded so each board would fit without any slack, designed to lock the weight evenly, preventing the structure from toppling. There were no nails, there were no screws, nothing was attached to the ground. Everything functioned purely through the combination of weight, gravity, and precise fitting. It was a masterpiece of physics achieved by people who had no formal understanding of physics. But this alone would not hold walls so tall. More was necessary. Therefore, God also commanded crossbars, long beams of acacia covered in gold that passed through rings on the boards. These bars united the walls laterally, transforming the entire structure into a single rigid body. It was literally a modular, prefabricated system, centuries before modern engineering existed, And the most impressive part, all of this needed to be assembled and disassembled without wearing out the fittings. For 40 years, they repeated this process in the desert. 40 years. Assemble, disassemble, carry, raise again. It never misaligned. It never needed remodeling. It never lost stability. Because every part followed exact measurements given directly by God and executed by craftsmen filled with His Spirit. The people would only see God's glory later, when the tabernacle was complete. But to get there, they first had to trust, hammer after hammer, board after board, that all of this would work. And it did. The structure stood, the golden skeleton waited. But God did not want only walls and beams. What came next would transform the interior into something that resembled heaven itself. The structure stood. The golden skeleton waited in the desert sun, magnificent and incomplete. But God did not want merely walls and beams. The tabernacle needed to be beautiful inside, so beautiful that it would remind those who entered of heaven itself. And here enters one of the most extraordinary parts of the entire project: the fabric. God did not request just any textile. He requested the most complex fabric the ancient world knew how to create: fine linen, artistically woven with intertwined cherubim, extremely rare colors, blue, purple, and crimson, each carrying profound meaning. Every thread dyed by hand, every figure calculated before the weaving even began. But the question arises, how do you obtain such rare colors in the middle of the desert? Blue and purple were made by crushing the glands of marine mollusks. Each drop of pigment cost more than silver, and the people were in Sinai, far from the Mediterranean Sea, far from Phoenicia, far from the luxury trade routes. The answer lies in Exodus chapter 35. Everyone who had these things brought them as an offering to the Lord. These fabrics, colors, threads, and materials probably came from Egypt, handed over as plunder on the night of Passover when the Egyptians begged the Hebrews to leave quickly, surrendering their riches. But possessing the material was not enough. It needed to be transformed. And this work fell to those the Bible calls all the skilled women whose hearts moved them. They spun, dyed, dried in the sun, repeated the process dozens of times until achieving the exact color God requested. The interior of the tabernacle, called in Scripture the tabernacle proper, was woven with cherubim, but this does not mean they were simple embroidery placed on top. No, the text indicates the cherubim were part of the fabric's structure, appearing directly in the cloth as it was woven, something that required mathematics, planning, and a complex loom. Before beginning, they needed to plan the design, count the threads, predict where each color started and ended. Imagine the result before it existed. One error in calculation and the cherub would appear crooked or out of place, or repeated at the wrong measurement. We are talking about women in the desert, without manuals, without diagrams, without models, creating the equivalent of royal tapestries inside an improvised tent. And the result? From the outside, the tabernacle looked like a rough common tent with skins exposed to the sun. But inside, whoever entered saw heaven. Cherubim embroidered above their heads, vivid colors reflecting the golden light of the lampstand, fabrics that shimmered as if made for kings. The sacred hidden beneath the simple, the eternal hidden beneath the common. While the fabrics were being prepared, another critical part needed to take form: the priestly garments. These were not merely clothes. They were not decorative robes for ceremonial purposes. They were equipment, spiritual protection gear, survival suits for standing in the presence of infinite holiness. Exodus chapter 28 describes each piece with staggering detail, because entering God's presence in the most holy place was not a common religious act. It was an act of absolute risk. One error, one wrong measurement, one omitted detail, one moment of carelessness, and the priest could die instantly. Imagine putting on clothing knowing this. Imagine dressing each morning fully aware that the fabric on your body is the only barrier between you and death by divine fire. The most impressive piece was the breastplate, a square of folded fabric containing 12 precious stones, each representing a tribe of Israel. These were not decorative stones. They were cut, polished, engraved with surgical precision with the names of the tribes. In antiquity, to engrave a gem required abrasive powder, hand drills, extreme skill, and patience at an absolute level. And all of this in the middle of the desert. The breastplate was attached by chains of pure gold to the shoulder pieces of the priestly ephod. The physical weight was real. The symbolic weight was even greater. The priest carried all of Israel on his chest when he entered before God. Every name, every tribe, every family, every child, every elder, all of them represented there, pressed against his heart. But perhaps the most unsettling part of the vestments was the blue robe, with pomegranates of fabric alternating with golden bells on the hem. Exodus chapter 28 verse 35 declares, "The sound of the bells will be heard when he enters the sanctuary, so that he will not die." The bells were literally a life monitor. While they rang, the people outside knew, he is still alive, he is still moving. God's presence has not consumed him. Silence would be fatal. Although the Bible does not confirm it, many ancient scholars believe a rope was tied around the priest's waist. If he died inside, no one could enter to retrieve him. He would be pulled back out. A possible detail, a real fear. On the priest's forehead was a plate of pure gold with the inscription, "Holiness to the Lord." It was not a decorative phrase, it was a warning. This man did not enter in his own name, but on behalf of an entire nation. Sewing all of this in the desert required absurd precision. Exact proportions, balanced weights, reinforced threads, rare materials, delicate dyes, measurements given directly by God. A garment that, at its core, was a frontier between life and death. And while the priest dressed outside, the craftsman finalized each piece that would give life to the sanctuary. Almost everything was ready. Only one thing remained: to assemble, for the first time, the house of God in the desert. Exodus chapter 40 gives us the exact date. On the first day of the first month of the second year, nearly 1 year after crossing the Red Sea, Moses received God's final command: set up the tabernacle. And so the assembly began. The silver bases were placed on the desert floor, 100 massive pieces, heavy, gleaming under the sun. Men aligned them carefully, one by one, with the precision a modular system demands. No margin for error, no space for misalignment. The acacia boards covered in gold were raised. It took several men to lift each board while another team fitted its tenons into the silver bases. A wall of gold rising in the middle of the desert, the structure took shape like a golden skeleton emerging from dust. The long crossbars were slid through the golden rings. The fabrics were stretched over the top. First, the innermost curtain, the most sacred, with cherubim woven by hand. Over it, the covering of goat hair. Then the skins dyed red. And finally, the outer layer, resistant to sun and storm. From outside, it looked like a common tent. From inside, it looked like heaven itself. The interior was furnished with trembling hands and held breath. The Ark of the Covenant was placed in the most holy place. The mercy seat rested upon it. The embroidered veil was hung, separating the holy place from the most holy. The table of showbread was positioned with 12 fresh loaves. The lampstand was lit, albatat, 7 flames illuminating pure gold. The altar of incense began burning fragrance before God. The bronze altar and the basin were placed in the outer court. The house was assembled. But the most important answer was still missing. Would God accept the tabernacle? The people gathered outside. The desert fell silent. Even the wind seemed to stop moving. Moses exited the tent after checking every detail. Every piece was exactly as God had commanded on the mountain. Every measurement precise, every material in its proper place, every color correct, every weight balanced. Then it happened. A dense cloud came from above, descended over the tent of meeting, grew, became heavy, became thick, filled the interior so completely that even Moses could not enter. The same Moses who saw the burning bush, who ascended Mount Sinai amid fire, who spoke with God face to face as a friend. Even he could not pass through the cloud, because the glory of the living God now dwelt among them. The tabernacle was no longer a human work, it was an inhabited house. And from that day forward, when the cloud lifted, Israel marched. When the cloud stopped, the tabernacle was assembled again. For 40 years, the divine presence guided the people, visible to all. The glory moved, the people followed. A simple tent became the center of the universe for an entire nation. For 4 decades, this extraordinary structure was assembled and disassembled hundreds of times. Each journey began when the cloud lifted. Each stop occurred when the cloud settled again. The tabernacle was the beating heart of the nation. Where it stood, God stood. And where God stood, there was direction. But a remarkable detail emerges in the biblical narrative. This tent was never the final plan. It was temporary, mobile, adapted for pilgrims, made to accompany a people on a journey. The system's brilliance lay in its perfect balance between permanence and portability. Every piece had to be both sacred and practical, heavy enough to be stable when erected, yet manageable enough to be carried through the desert. The silver bases, each weighing 35 kilograms, could be transported by teams of men. The gold-covered boards, though massive, could be dismantled and carried. The fabrics could be carefully folded and protected during transport. The Levites were assigned specific duties for transport and assembly. Different families carried different components. Some carried the boards and bases, others transported the fabrics and coverings. Still others were responsible for the sacred furnishings inside. It was a choreographed operation, a divine logistics system that functioned with mechanical precision. Every man knew his role. Every piece had its designated carriers. Every element had its proper method of transport and handling. Consider what this meant practically. When the cloud lifted, the signal to move came without warning. There was no time for lengthy preparation. The entire structure had to come down efficiently, safely, reverently. The sacred objects had to be properly covered before the Levites could touch them. The priests performed specific rituals to prepare each item for transport. The boards had to be removed without damaging the gold overlay. The fabrics had to be folded without tearing the delicate weaving. Then came the march through the desert. Miles of sand and rock, carrying tons of precious materials. The gold alone weighed hundreds of kilograms. The silver bases added tons more. The wooden structure, though relatively lighter, was still massive. And all of this moved through one of Earth's harshest environments. When the cloud stopped, the entire process reversed. Bases positioned, boards raised, crossbars inserted, fabrics stretched, furnishings arranged. The house of God reconstructed in hours. For 40 years, this cycle repeated. And through it all, not a single board cracked. Not a single base wore out. Not a single measurement shifted. The impossible remained impossible, yet utterly real. The tabernacle stood complete, inhabited by glory, functioning as designed. But living in such close proximity to the manifest presence of God carried risks that the people would soon understand in the most horrific way imaginable. Nadab and Abihu, sons of Aaron, priests consecrated to serve in the tabernacle, made a decision that would immortalize their names in Scripture as a warning for all generations. They offered unauthorized fire before the Lord, contrary to his command. The text does not elaborate on their exact transgression. Were they drunk? Were they careless? Did they use the wrong incense? Did they enter at the wrong time? Did they fail to follow the prescribed ritual? The specifics remain mysterious, which perhaps makes the story more terrifying. What we know is this: they brought strange fire that God had not commanded, into his presence. And fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them. They died instantly, right there before God. Imagine Aaron's horror. One moment his sons are serving as priests. The next moment they are corpses, struck down by the very God they were meant to serve. Moses' words to Aaron cut like a blade. This is what the Lord spoke, saying, "Among those who are near me, I will be sanctified, and before all the people I will be glorified." Aaron held his peace. He could not even mourn openly. The message was unmistakable. Proximity to holiness demands absolute obedience. The bodies had to be removed from the sanctuary, but no one could simply walk in and retrieve them. Moses called Mishael and Elzaphan, cousins of Aaron, and commanded them to carry their relatives away from the front of the sanctuary. They approached with fear, lifted the corpses by their tunics, and carried them outside the camp. The priestly garments, those elaborate vestments that took so long to create, still covered the dead men. But the life inside was gone, consumed by the very glory those garments were meant to protect against. This incident revealed a fundamental truth about the tabernacle. It was not a religious building in the modern sense. It was not a place for casual worship or comfortable spirituality. It was the intersection point of two incompatible realities: human sinfulness and divine holiness. The tabernacle system, with all its elaborate rituals, specific materials, and precise measurements, existed to create a buffer, a controlled environment where that intersection could occur without destroying everyone involved. Nadab and Abihu crossed the line. They treated the holy as common. and the holy consumed them. The tabernacle was both invitation and warning. Come near to God, but come exactly as He prescribes, or do not come at all. Once a year, on the Day of Atonement, the full weight of the tabernacle's purpose became devastatingly clear. This was the day when the high priest would enter the most holy place, pass the veil, into the direct presence of God, dwelling above the mercy seat between the cherubim. No other day, no other person, no room for error. The preparation alone took days, but the ceremony took only minutes. Minutes that could mean life or death. The high priest could not simply walk into the most holy place. First, he had to offer sacrifices for his own sins and the sins of his household. Then he took a censer full of burning coals from the altar before the Lord, and 2 handfuls of finely ground fragrant incense. He entered behind the veil. The smoke of the incense covered the mercy seat above the testimony so that he would not die. Even then, even following every prescription, death remained a possibility. He took the blood of the bull, offered for his own sin, and sprinkled it with his finger on the mercy seat on the east side. Then he sprinkled some of the blood with his finger 7 times before the mercy seat. After that, he slaughtered the goat of the sin offering for the people and brought its blood behind the veil, sprinkling it on and before the mercy seat as he did with the bull's blood. Every action precise, every movement deliberate. One misstep, one forgotten detail, one moment of presumption, and the divine presence could strike him dead. Outside, the people waited in silence. They could not see what happened behind the veil. They could only wait and wonder. Was the sacrifice accepted? Would the priest emerge alive? Would God forgive their sins for another year? The tension must have been unbearable. Time stretched. Every second felt like an hour. Then finally, the priest would emerge, alive, bearing the evidence that God had accepted the atonement. The people could breathe again. For another year, the covering held. But this annual ritual revealed the temporary nature of the entire tabernacle system. It was never meant to be permanent. The fact that the same sacrifices had to be repeated year after year proved they could never truly remove sin. They could cover it, atone for it temporarily, push back the consequences for a season. But the blood of bulls and goats could never permanently cleanse the human conscience or transform the human heart. The tabernacle was pointing forward, always forward, to something greater, someone greater, a better sacrifice, a better priest, a better covenant. The entire structure was a shadow, magnificent and terrible, of a reality yet to come. Sometimes the cloud stayed in one place for days, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months. And during those long periods of stillness, the Israelites learned one of the hardest lessons of faith. Waiting in God's presence is as important as moving at His command. The tabernacle stood erected, the sacrifices continued, the priests performed their duties, but the people remained camped in the same location, staring at the cloud that refused to lift. This waiting was not passive. It was active obedience of a different kind. The temptation to move ahead of God must have been enormous. Scouts could see better camping grounds in the distance. Water sources lay just a day's march away. The current location might have been uncomfortable, exposed, less than ideal, but the cloud had not moved. And until it did, Israel stayed put. The command was absolute. When the cloud lifts, move. When the cloud stops, stop. Human convenience, human wisdom, human planning, none of it mattered. Only the cloud. This created a peculiar rhythm to their existence. They could never settle too deeply. They could never assume permanence. Houses were not built. Gardens were not planted. Long-term plans could not be made, because at any moment, day or night, the cloud could lift, and the entire nation would need to mobilize. Yet during the waiting periods, life had to continue. Children were born. Disputes were settled. Work was done. Worship proceeded. The tabernacle remained the center, the anchor, the reminder that God was present even when He seemed stationary. The longest periods of waiting must have tested faith severely. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The same view every morning. The same location every evening. Some probably grumbled, some probably questioned. Why are we still here? Why hasn't God moved us? Is He listening? Has He forgotten? But the cloud remained, immovable, a visible manifestation of divine will that superseded human impatience. The lesson was brutal in its simplicity. God's timing is not subject to human preference. And then, without warning, the cloud would lift, perhaps in the middle of the night, perhaps during a meal, perhaps during the heat of midday. It did not matter. When the cloud moved, everything moved. The tabernacle was dismantled with practiced efficiency. The camp broke up with organized chaos. Thousands of people, hundreds of thousands, moving in response to a cloud. Moving because God moved, following because He led. This was Israel's reality for 4 decades. And in that reality, the tabernacle was more than a religious structure. It was the physical proof that God was not distant, not abstract, not theoretical. He was there, present, leading, waiting when they needed to wait, moving when it was time to move. The cloud and the tabernacle together formed a system of divine guidance more reliable than any human map. When Israel finally entered the Promised Land, the tabernacle was set up in Shiloh. There it remained for centuries, faithfully serving its purpose, housing the ark, receiving the sacrifices, maintaining the divine presence among the people. But a contrast began to trouble the conscience of Israel's greatest king. David, sitting in his palace of cedar, surrounded by the finest materials Lebanon could provide, looked toward the tabernacle and felt the wrongness of it. "I dwell in a house of cedar," he said to Nathan the prophet, "but the ark of God dwells in a tent." The statement contained no arrogance, only recognition. The king of Israel lived in luxury while the king of the universe lived in curtains. David's house was permanent, solid, impressive. God's house was temporary, mobile, humble. The imbalance gnawed at David's heart, not because he wanted to elevate himself, but because he wanted to honor God. The tabernacle had served its purpose magnificently during the wilderness years, but Israel was no longer wandering. They had a land, they had cities, they had resources. Surely now was the time to build something permanent for God. Nathan's initial response was encouraging. "Go, do all that is in your heart, for the Lord is with you." But that same night, God spoke to Nathan with a different message. "Tell David that he will not build me a house." The reason was not David's lack of resources or skill or devotion. It was blood. David was a man of war. His hands had killed too many enemies, spilled too much blood, won too many battles. The temple, God's permanent dwelling place, would be built by a man of peace. That man would be David's son, Solomon. The refusal must have stung. David had unified the kingdom, defeated Israel's enemies, brought peace and prosperity. He had brought the ark to Jerusalem with dancing and celebration. He loved God with genuine passion. Yet the greatest desire of his heart, to build God's house, was denied. But notice God's response. He did not reject David, he redirected him. David could not build the temple, but he could prepare for it. He could gather materials, he could make plans, he could accumulate the wealth, he could organize the workforce. And David threw himself into this preparation with the same intensity he brought to everything. He amassed enormous quantities of gold and silver. He stockpiled bronze and iron in quantities too great to measure. He gathered cedar logs from Lebanon. He commissioned skilled craftsmen. He drew up plans based on revelation, patterns shown to him by God's Spirit. Everything Solomon would need, David provided. The temple would be Solomon's achievement, but it would be built on David's foundation. The message embedded in this story cuts deep. Sometimes God says no, not because we are unworthy, but because He has a different timing, a different person, a different plan. David's hands were made for war. Solomon's hands would be made for building. The tabernacle had served during the journey. The temple would serve during the establishment. Every structure has its season. Every design has its purpose. And the wisdom to know the difference between them comes only from God. When Solomon ascended to the throne, he inherited not just a kingdom, but a vision. The vision his father David could not fulfill. God appeared to Solomon in a dream at Gibeon and said, "Ask what I shall give you." Solomon could have requested anything: long life, wealth, military victory, fame. Instead, he asked for wisdom to govern the people. God granted the request and added what Solomon did not ask for: riches and honor beyond any king before or after. Solomon began the temple construction in the 4th year of his reign, 480 years after the Israelites came out of Egypt. The location was Mount Moriah, the very place where Abraham had nearly sacrificed Isaac centuries earlier, the same mountain where God had provided a substitute ram. Now, on that same ground, God's permanent house would rise. The symbolism was inescapable. The place of sacrifice becomes the place of dwelling. The temple was not simply a larger version of the tabernacle. It was an architectural transformation of the same theological concepts. The dimensions doubled. The holy place was twice as long, the most holy place twice as wide and twice as high. but the fundamental design remained. The same three-part structure: outer court, holy place, most holy place. The same separation by veil, the same position for the ark, the same presence of God dwelling between the cherubim. The tent had become a building, but the pattern remained unchanged. The materials escalated to almost incomprehensible luxury. The interior walls were covered with pure gold. The floor was overlaid with gold. The cherubim in the most holy place were carved from olive wood and covered with gold, their wings spanning the entire width of the room. The doors were made of olive wood carved with cherubim, palm trees, and flowers, all overlaid with gold. The amount of gold Solomon used would be worth billions in modern currency. Nothing like it had ever been built. The construction took 7 years. 30,000 laborers worked in shifts. 70,000 men carried materials. 80,000 quarried stone in the mountains. 3,300 foremen supervised the work. The stones were dressed at the quarry so that no hammer or chisel was heard in the temple area during construction. Even the building process honored the sacredness of the location. This was not merely construction. This was an act of worship extended over 7 years. When the temple was finally complete, Solomon assembled all Israel for the dedication. The priests brought the Ark of the Covenant into the most holy place and positioned it beneath the cherubim. They brought up the tabernacle itself, the tent of meeting, and all the sacred furnishings that had served in it. Everything that had functioned in the desert now entered the permanent structure. The transition was complete. Then, just as at the tabernacle's first assembly, the cloud filled the temple. The glory of the Lord filled the house so completely that the priests could not perform their service. God had moved from tent to temple, but his presence remained the same: overwhelming, undeniable, magnificent, and terrifying. The temple stood for centuries as the center of Jewish worship, the heart of the nation, the place where heaven and earth touched. But eventually, it fell. Babylon destroyed Solomon's temple in 586 BC. The people were carried into exile, torn from the land, separated from the dwelling place of God. 70 years later, they returned and rebuilt, but the second temple never matched the first's glory. The ark was gone. The cloud did not return. The divine presence seemed diminished, distant, filtered through centuries of waiting and longing. Then, in the reign of Herod, the second temple was massively expanded and beautified, becoming one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world. The disciples marveled at its massive stones and impressive buildings, but Jesus said something that shocked them to their core: "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." They thought he spoke of Herod's temple, which had taken 46 years to build. But he spoke of his body. The temple of God was no longer a building, it was a person. Everything the tabernacle and temple represented found its fulfillment in Christ. The veil that separated the holy place from the most holy place, that barrier no one could cross except the high priest once a year, tore from top to bottom when Jesus died. Not from bottom to top, as if human hands had ripped it. From top to bottom, as if God himself had torn it open. The way into God's presence was now open to all, not through animal blood, but through the blood of the perfect sacrifice. The writer of Hebrews makes the connection explicit. Christ entered the most holy place once for all by his own blood, obtaining eternal redemption. He is both the high priest and the sacrifice, both the mediator and the offering. The entire system of tabernacle and temple was pointing to him. The golden lampstand illuminating the holy place, Christ is the light of the world. The bread of the presence on the golden table, Christ is the bread of life. The altar where sacrifices burned continually, Christ is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. The ark containing the law, Christ fulfilled the law perfectly. But the transformation goes even further. Paul writes that believers themselves are now the temple of the Holy Spirit. The dwelling place of God is no longer a tent in the desert or a building in Jerusalem. It is human hearts, human bodies, human lives yielded to God's presence. The same glory that filled the tabernacle, the same presence that made Moses unable to enter, now dwells inside everyone who believes. The impossible made possible, the distant made intimate, the external made internal. The tabernacle in the wilderness was never the end goal. It was always pointing forward, always gesturing towards something greater. That impossible structure built by ex-slaves in the desert, with its precise measurements and expensive materials and elaborate rituals, was a shadow. And shadows only exist because something real casts them. That something real was Christ. The tabernacle showed us what God wanted: to dwell with his people, The temple expanded that vision, but Christ completed it. The progression moves from tent to temple to body to believer, from temporary to permanent to eternal, from shadow to substance to living reality. And so the story of the tabernacle ends where it always intended to go, not in a building made with hands, but in the presence of God dwelling directly with humanity, unmediated, unfiltered, permanent. The tent is folded, the temple is gone, but the presence remains, closer now than it ever was in the desert, more accessible than it ever was in Jerusalem. What was impossible in the wilderness, God dwelling among sinful people, is now the reality of every believer's daily life. The tabernacle was God's way of saying, I want to be near you. Christ is God's way of saying, now I am.